When you think of Jesus, what comes to mind? Many individuals, when they think of the name Jesus, they will immediately think to the cross. And rightfully so, don't you agree? Because without Jesus going to the cross, you and I could not be in this hour tonight. Though we might still exist, we would not be in an hour of worship without Him. Many people, when they think of Jesus, they think about Him in the early stages of the book of Matthew when He was born. That's a good occasion too, isn't it? Because without the birth of Christ, we can't think about the cross of Christ, and thus we still cannot even entertain this very hour that we're discussing tonight. So what do you think of when you think of Jesus? What comes to your mind? What I want you to do this evening is I want you to go on with me a journey. And I want to look at Jesus. And I want to look at Jesus who lived for His people. And inside of that, I want us to see a number of things that will help us recognize who Jesus is as we compare Him to what we read in Scripture and as we think about Him in this life. I want us to think about Jesus who had it all, but yet He became poor. I want us to think about Jesus who really had no need to be born, but yet He came in the form or the fashion as of a man. I want us to think about Jesus who left an area to become a servant. I want us to think about Jesus who left an eternal place that we in our small human minds cannot imagine, to come to a place where it said of Jesus on this earth that He had no home. I want us to think about Jesus who is involved in creation, yet when it comes to this world, He lived just like you and I did. He was tempted just like you and I are tempted, yet in the end of His life, He was bound. Then finally, I want you to think about Jesus who met a death just as we will meet, yet He was here for a higher purpose. He was the sacrifice that we needed. And hopefully by the time we get done, we will have a better appreciation for Jesus who lived right here on the face of this earth. But you and I, when we hear the name Jesus, can say, He certainly lived for His people. Let's begin with our first point tonight. He became poor that we might become rich. And to do so, go with me to James chapter 2. This was read for us just a moment ago. James chapter 2. I want you to think about Jesus for just a moment, and I want you to think about Jesus before Matthew chapter 1, verse 1. I want you to think about a Jesus who had never been here in the form of a man. I want you to think for just a moment the grandeur of heaven. We see a glimpse of heaven pictured in the book of Revelation, a place with no pains and sorrows, a place where light is pure and true, a place where there are no problems. And yet I want you to think about Jesus, who had everything this world could imagine. By the way, you could even say this about Jesus, who was involved in every aspect of creation for us. And yet He left it all. How many millionaires or billionaires do you know of in this world who left it all just to be like somebody else? But yet it's Jesus who had everything beyond our comprehension just to be here for us, to be poor. You go into James chapter 2 and you notice inside of verse 5 these words. James chapter 2, picking up in verse 5. He says, "Hearken, my beloved brethren, hath not God chosen the poor of this world to be rich in the faith, and heirs of the kingdom which He hath promised to them that love Him?" Isn't it interesting that He left everything so that we could have everything? I find it interesting when you roll into verse 6, this question that comes in James chapter 2. Do not rich men oppress you and draw you before judgment seats? He says in the beginning of verse 6, but ye have despised the poor. I think I can say this aptly to us because we live in a society where we think we're poor, but we're not. I'm scanning the room for just a moment. Let me check something here. All right, I'm looking at a group of people that are just like me. Here's what I know about us tonight. We came to church this morning. We drove here in a vehicle. We left our homes. We left this place to go back home. We drove back this evening. Ladies and gentlemen, that's a privilege that few in our world can understand. How many times have you ever felt poor? How many times have you ever been poor? Yet think about Jesus for just a moment. He left everything so that we could be His. I believe it's harder for us to look at James chapter 2, verse 5, because, ladies and gentlemen, we really, in the world's scope, are not the poor of this world. No, I don't say that high-mightily. I don't say that so we can look at the world and go, look at us. But let me ask you this question. If you and I were not as well off as we are, would we be here? If we were more rich, if we had all the riches of the world, would we be here? If we had none of the riches of the world, would we still follow the same Jesus? By the way, He calls those that are poor in this world to be rich in faith. And I love the middle and end of verse 5, to be heirs of the kingdom which He promised of them that love Him. Why did He do that? So that we could have something of value. You see, you and I, we put value in certain things. We have a lot of value in this world, don't we? We have value in our homes, and we hope the market holds that value. We have value in other financial gains of which we hold, and we hope the market holds those values. We put values in other things throughout this world. But what's the greatest value of this life? I would suggest to you and I, the greatest value in this life is knowing through the Word of God that you are saved. And ladies and gentlemen, the only way you can do that is to know the Jesus who became poor that we might become rich. I want you tonight to change the way you think about poor and rich. And I want you to make it only an eternal discussion. Because, ladies and gentlemen, as Christians, we are rich. No, we might not have all the money in the world, and thankfully, we are blessed to live in the means that we live in today. But we're rich. And let me tell you, Jesus, He came here to serve His people, and He became poor that we might become rich. Not only that, in the second place, as you go to John chapter 1, Jesus was born that we might be born again. The greatest days of most couples' lives, most married couples' lives, are the days that their children are born. And I've said this a million times, just get ready for 1,000,001. But I can remember every moment the day that both of my boys were born. And you probably can as well, because you know what it means to see life come into this world. I want you to imagine something with me for just a moment. I want you to imagine a world where Jesus never entered. I know that's hard, but I want you to do that for just a minute. I want you to imagine a world where Jesus never entered it. Now we can't imagine a world where God does not exist, because without God, there cannot be a world. But just imagine a world where Jesus never entered. What would today look like? Well, I'll suggest at least three things. Number one, if Jesus did not exist, what are we here for? So that changes the scope of our world, doesn't it? That not just changes tonight, but it changes this morning. What were we here for? If Jesus never entered this world, what would the world look like? We understand in the New Testament the comparison between light and darkness, between Christ and the world. Christ is the light, darkness of the world. What would the world look like without light? Just close your eyes and think about darkness. That's what the world would look like. And number three, what would the future look like if Jesus never entered the world? But yet Jesus is one who served his people. You go to John chapter 1. It's my favorite introduction to a book in John chapter 1, because you start off in John and you start in verse 1 and you read in the beginning was the Word. Now notice the word is capitalized. We're talking about Jesus here. In the beginning, Jesus, the Word, he was there. The Word was with God, and the Word was God, and the same was in the beginning with God. You read all this down, and you make yourself down to verse 14, and you see this one that's called Jesus. And you read about him in verse 14. And the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us, and we begat his glory, the glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. Now read into verse 15. John bare witness of him and cried, saying, This was he of whom I spake. That cometh after me is preferred before me, for he was before me. Jesus was born that we might be born again. You see, without Jesus entering this world, as we read about him in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, we cannot think about the term salvation. I want you to think about the Old Testament system, the law. And I want you to think about what happened to sin in the Old Testament law. Once a year, they went to the most holy place to make that sacrifice, remember? And the Most High Priest went to the most holy place. And he performed that ceremony, and in that, what happened to sin? If you'll remember in the Old Testament, it was simply rolled forward. I want you to see the comparison of the Old Testament and the New Testament. Without Jesus being here on the face of this earth, our sins were just rolled forward. They were never forgiven. But yet in the New Testament system, you and I can be born again of water and of spirit, Jesus said. Not entering into the mother's womb a second time, as that great question was asked of him. But we are able to become in his body. And I want you to think about Jesus who served his people. He was born that we might be born again. Now, what does this mean to us? John 1:14 through 15. Well, number one, it means that Jesus came to suffer. The very fact that Jesus came to this earth means he came to die. I'm reminded of that every time I read the words of Jesus when he says, I'm here to do the will of him that sent me. I'm here to finish my Father's business. When Jesus was at the temple and his parents had left him, we read about this in the book of Matthew. They come back and ask him, why did you stay? If you allow me to paraphrase. You remember what he said? Did you not know that I must be about my Father's business? Well, what was his Father's business? We'll go to the last few chapters of the book of Matthew, and that was his Father's business. You see, he came and he was born so that we might be born again, so that we didn't have to deal with the ramifications, the end result of our sin. Number three, Jesus came and served his people, and he became a servant that we might become sons. Go with me to Galatians. Galatians chapter 4. There's something that happens interestingly. I want you to go with me to Galatians 4, and I want you to look at verse 6 first. Galatians 4, verse 6, and I just want you to read to the first comma. And because ye are sons. What does that indicate to us? Well, that indicated that whoever we're talking about right here in Galatians 4:6, in Galatians chapter 4:6, that we recognize that these individuals, they were not sons before, and now they are sons in whatever category we're discussing. Go back to verse 4. But when the fullness of time was come, God sent forth his Son, made of a woman, made under the law, to redeem them that were under the law, that we might receive the adoption of sons. And because you are sons. We understand the very idea of adoption in this world. We understand when children are without their parents and they need adopting and uprooting and a replanting in a new family. We also understand that when it comes to ourselves, don't we? There's not a person that exists on the face of this earth that's not accountable to God's Word that does not understand this principle. Before you were a Christian, who were you a servant of? Well, a couple of ideas here. Number one, did you not serve yourself? Is that not who we used to serve? Before you became a Christian, did you not do everything you wanted to do? However you wanted to do it, whenever you wanted to do it, with whoever you were around? Was that not how we lived? I know we don't like to answer that, but the truth is, that's how we used to live. Number two, we recognize this because of the very redeeming nature of Jesus Christ. If we had to be redeemed, that means we needed to be redeemed of something. That's sin, isn't it? Isn't sin our greatest problem? For all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. Does a book not say that to you and I? We very much understand the very idea of adoption because we used to serve this world. But we were adopted from that. We were taken from this world and placed into the body of Christ. And I love that inside of verse 6. And because you are sons. You see, Jesus came to serve His people. Think about this. He left everything that was perfect. There's not a flawed thing in the place that's called heaven. There never has been. There never will be. And because of that, you and I can understand the severity of the situation. He left all of that to die. We translated it this way in our point. He became a servant so that we might become sons. We can be a part of everything that's talked about in the Old Testament. I want you to think about the Old Testament for just a minute. Everything that's mentioned in the Old Testament is pointing to something that takes place in the New Testament. You go to Genesis 3:15. It talks about Jesus. You march yourself through the Old Testament and you will see that Messiah that was coming, that suffering servant that was coming, the one who was going to be a lamb that was led before to be slaughtered. What's that pointing to? That's pointing to Jesus. By the way, everything that happens in the Old Testament culminates in the events we read about in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Now you think about this for just a minute. Of all that time span of the things that took place from the book of Genesis to the very beginning of the book of Matthew, Jesus knew what He was getting ready to do. And yet He left anyways. Now you answer a question for me, and I already know the answer. How many of us like to do something that we don't want to do? You see, Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, He prayed 3 prayers. In that third segment, talking about those prayers, we learn that He used the same words. And here are the words: if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Jesus knew the pain that was going to be in the cross. Jesus knew the humiliation that would take place in the cross. By the way, we often say that words don't hurt us, but let me tell you something. How many times do words hurt? He understood what was going to be done to Him in the cross. He understood that His own brethren were going to turn against Him to take Him to the cross. And yet He did all of that so that we could become sons. And I love verse 6. And because you are sons, that tells us something. These people that were being written to here in Galatians 4, they became sons. That means we can as well. You see, we need to see Jesus who served His people so that they could become sons. We need to see Jesus who served His people so that we could be individuals who inherit an eternal home. It's in Matthew chapter 8. Probably one of the most interesting passages about Jesus was Jesus talking about his home. We love our homes, don't we? I do. My home is filled with laughter on most days. A lot of other noises that you would not understand, and neither do I. And there's something that interesting that takes place. From time to time, we'll send our boys off to either my parents or Kelly's parents, and that first night that they're gone, we breathe that sigh of relief. Whew. But then we recognize something. Boy, it's quiet. And it makes us recognize how much we love our home. You see, a home is not made up of four walls, just as much as a church building is not made up of four walls. We love our homes, I do. Now, our home is not perfect, just as yours is not. Sometimes there's tragedy in our homes. Sometimes there are problems in our homes. But we love our homes. But it's Jesus here in Matthew 8, picking up in verse 19. A certain scribe comes to Jesus and said, "Master, I will follow thee wheresoever thou goest." Verse 19 is a wonderful statement. It's one of those statements that gets made that we think, yeah, I can do that. One of those statements that we think, boy, he had it right. Then we read verse 20. Verse 20 reads this way. Jesus said unto him, "The foxes have holes, the birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man hath not where to lay his head." Think about the home of Jesus for just a minute. There was not even a place to lay his head. Now, I love this. I believe it's a beautiful illustration of what is to come for God's people. Heaven is described as an eternal rest. And Jesus says, while on this earth, I don't even have a place to lay my head. Do you see Jesus? Jesus was one who came to serve his people. You know, many times we feel like Matthew 8:19. Matter of fact, we try to live our lives by that statement, don't we? But there's something I want us to recognize for just a minute. Sometimes we're not Matthew 8:19. Sometimes we struggle with following Jesus where he goes. You know, it is hard. We need to recognize this about Christianity. It's difficult. It is difficult to be the only people that are not doing everything else the world is doing. That is, whether you recognize it or not. It's difficult to be the people who don't say certain things in our society because they're not right. It's difficult. It's difficult, folks, when people know that you're a Christian. I'll do something I normally don't do, but this is yes and this is no. By show of hands, how many people used to think Christianity was going to be easy? All right. Who thinks it's still easy? It's easy to say, I'll go wherever you want me to go. When I first started going overseas a few years ago, almost 5 years ago now, I thought, man, this is easy. It's nothing. Until I was sitting at the Sunday morning service in Quezon City, Philippines, and they sang the song, and one of the phrases in the song is, "And if I die on foreign fields someday," it clicked. Uh-oh. It's not as easy as I thought. Doesn't that happen to us in this life? But in those moments, we still have Jesus in Matthew 8:20. With all the things that were going on in his world during his time, he didn't even have a place to lay his head. But yet he has made it possible for us to have an eternal home. The very concept of eternity is rest, pleasantries, good things, the opposite of here and now. And that was Jesus who served his people. You see, Jesus in this life, he was also someone who was bound that we might go free. I take your minds to John chapter 8. And I need us to see something in John chapter 8 because we're found in John chapter 8, especially in verses 34, 35, and 36. Jesus is answering a group of people here in verse 34. In verse 33, some individuals came and said, We're Abraham's seed, and we've never been in bondage to any man. How saith thee? You say you're going to make us free. Well, number one, think about Abraham's seed for just a minute. Were they ever in bondage to any man? Well, the fact of the matter is, John 8:33, they had forgotten their own history. Abraham's seed had been in bondage a number of times, and they were made free. And by the way, it's evident, at least to me, and I hope to you, they were still in bondage. They just didn't get the spiritual bondage they were in yet. And Jesus says, verse 34, as we pick up, Verily, verily, I say unto you, whosoever committeth sin is the servant of sin. Jesus always gets to the heart of the matter. We've never been in bondage. He says, all right. If you'll allow me to paraphrase Jesus, let's ignore history for just a minute and let's talk about you. He says, whosoever is the servant of sin, whosoever that's committed sin is the servant of sin. And verse 35, and the servant abideth not in the house forever, but the Son abideth forever. Verse 36, if the Son therefore shall make you free, ye shall be free indeed. Now, how did Jesus make us free? That's what we have to figure out. And I want you to go in your minds to just before the scenes of the cross. Matter of fact, it takes you to the scenes of the Garden of Gethsemane, doesn't it? Where Jesus was praying with the disciples, and he had woke them up several times. And that segment ends where Jesus recognizes and verbally expresses it for us that he understands that the physical condition for them, it was weak. They had been up for some days now, and they had fallen asleep several times in those prayers. And not long after that comes the one who betrays Jesus. You remember his name, don't you? And the next thing you know, Jesus is bound. Now the texts do not indicate this to us, but it seems that even in that great courtroom scene, he's still bound. And then they bind him to a cross. Jesus was bound that we might go free. I want you to answer a question in your mind, and it's a question I'll have to answer as well, but why did Jesus go to the cross? You answer that and you'll understand why he's bound. Finally, tonight, we see Jesus who served his people. We see Jesus who was made a sacrifice that we might be righteous. Go with me to 2 Corinthians. 2 Corinthians chapter 5. I want you to read with me verse 21. He was made a sacrifice that we might be righteous. It reads this way, for he hath made him to be sin for us, who knew no sin, that we might be made the righteousness of God in him. I want you to answer a really important question. Now you search it out. Don't dismiss the question when you hear it. You're going to be inclined to dismiss the question. Don't dismiss it. I want you to really think about it. What sin did Jesus commit? Don't dismiss it. Just think about it. Really consider the beginning of the book of Matthew, the beginning of the book of Mark, the beginning of the book of Luke, the beginning of the book of John. And I want you to, it's in your minds, go through the timeline of Jesus. What sin did he commit? Then I want you to think about 2 Corinthians 5:21. It's the last verse of the chapter. It's the culmination of this very idea of reconciliation in God through Jesus Christ. And I want you to think of that first phrase in verse 21. For he hath made him to be sin for us. Jesus did not sin. Now, he was tempted, wasn't he? More than we would ever know. But Jesus did not sin. Now, think about this. But he carried ours. Doesn't that hurt you? It should. That should be a natural pain for you to feel. Not a physical pain, but an emotional pain. It should pain us to know that Jesus had to go to the cross because we couldn't handle it. It should pain us to know that Jesus went to the cross because we messed it all up. It should pain us to know that Jesus went to the cross as an innocent man. It should pain us to know that Jesus went to the cross as God. And we caused it. He was made to be sin. Now listen to this. For us. Read the next phrase. Who knew no sin. There's something that can never be said about us. Unfortunately, it can be said about children who die early. But ladies and gentlemen, as Christians, if you are a Christian right now, it will never be able to be said about you who knew no sin. But it can be about Jesus. Because he lived here, he endured here, because he served his people. And he was made a sacrifice so that we might be righteous. Read the rest of the verse. That we might be made the righteousness of God. Now listen to this. In him. You see, what I wanted us to do tonight is I wanted us to kind of see Jesus in a different light. I didn't just want to see him in that proverbial manger, though we need to see him there. I didn't just want to see him on the cross, though we need to see him there. We need to see the fact that he became poor. We need to know the fact that he was born. He didn't need to be born, but he was. For whose sake? Ours. We need to see that Jesus was one who became a servant. We need to know that he had no home. We need to know that in his last days he was bound, even though he was innocent. We need to know that he was made a sacrifice, that we might be righteous. You see, when you see Jesus as one who lived for his people, you see him in more than just the beginning and the end. You see him all the way through his life. And I think that helps us understand our commitment to Christ. That's what this lesson is really designed to do, is to help us further our commitment to Christ. If Jesus could give it all up, who else can give it all up? It's his people, isn't it? If Jesus could serve, who else can serve? It's his people, isn't it? If Jesus could be silent in the times we want to scream out for him, can't we be silent? If Jesus could endure all of the problems of this world and everything that the devil himself could throw at him face to face, can't we at least be faithful? Now, when I use the word faithful, I don't mean sinless. You will never be sinless on your own. You can't do it. But inside of Christ, you can be made free from sin. Back to that idea, in the righteousness of God in him. You see, tonight is all about our commitment to him. Because he was committed to us. He gave everything so that we could have something for eternity. And thus I want us to change the way we think about this life. Let's stop living for the here and now, and let's start living for the eternal. Do you see a difference in that life? I do. Because when we live for the eternal, our focus is set. The distractions are put away, and we know what we must do in this life. See, Jesus lived for His people so that His people could live after Him. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the calling that Jesus leaves before us tonight. We've got an interesting time tonight to look at the life of Jesus. Now let's turn the discussion on ourselves. Let's look at our own lives for just a moment. Dennis has picked out an invitation song for us. Let's just consider our lives. If you had to read a book about your life, what would it say? You see, we can read about the life of Jesus. Matter of fact, everything in this book is about Him. And we see a beautiful picture before us. But what if it was the book of us? What would it say? Well, the good news is, though we're not going to read our books aloud tonight, here's what we know. If we read our book tonight and it said that we were lost in sin, then the remedy is still in Jesus. If we read our book tonight and it says that we followed Him for a time, but we left His ways, the answer is still in the life of Jesus, who served His people. And folks, we're His people. We're His creation, number one. But as the church, we're His redeemed. And that gives us time to pause and think about our lives and what it says about how we live for Jesus. Maybe you tonight need to become a Christian. Well, the opportunity's before all of us to do that. You'll have to make that decision, but here's what I encourage you to do. Make sure you know what you're doing, not what somebody else wants you to do. Because if you don't ever make that decision for yourself, you will never follow it through your entire life. You might do it for a season, but you'll never do it long term. So look to His Word and find out what it says and obey that. Maybe you're a Christian tonight. As I look over this room and see most of you are, maybe there's something in your life that you recognize just now that needs to be made right with you and the Lord. Well, what a great opportunity it is to know that we can do that and that prayers can be prayed, James 5:16, so that we may be healed. Isn't it good to know that Jesus served His people and that we can still serve Him? You'll have to make your decision tonight. If you need to make your life right with the Lord, whether you need to become a Christian or whether you need to respond to the Lord's invitation again, let it be known as together we stand and sing.